Karoline Leavitt didn't shout. She didn't pound the table or resort to name-calling. But when she made a passing comment about Representative Jasmine Crockett's appearance and priorities during a live TV panel, it instantly struck a nerve. It wasn't just what she said, it was the way it was said and what it implied. In a measured tone, Leavitt criticized Crockett by saying she seemed more focused on her hair and catchphrases than on the Constitution. For some, it may have sounded like typical political commentary, but for many others, particularly in communities, long attuned to subtle digs cloaked in civility, it was anything but typical. The mention of Crockett's hair wasn't seen in isolation. It was viewed in the long context of American history, where black women in public life have often had their appearance scrutinized in ways that are demeaning, dismissive, and racially coded. From Congress to corporate boardrooms, hair has never just been hair. It has been politicized, policed, and used as shorthand to suggest lack of professionalism or seriousness. So when Karoline made that remark, even if unintentionally, she tapped into a deeply familiar and painful narrative for many viewers. In political circles, it's understood that language matters. Words don't land in a vacuum. They carry the weight of context. In this case, the implication that Crockett's commitment to her job could be undermined or overshadowed by her appearance brought out a flood of reactions. Social media users, political commentators, and civil rights advocates quickly pointed out that the phrase "focused on her hair" wasn't just about style. It was a dog whistle, intentional or not, that echoed stereotypes used to undermine black women's intellect, competence, and leadership for generations. What made the comment even more jarring for some was that Crockett has built her political profile not just on bold rhetoric, but on substantive engagement in key legislative matters. She's been outspoken in hearings, clear in her policy positions, and sharp in debates. Her rhetorical style may be energetic and unapologetically direct, but it is backed by law, policy knowledge, and an understanding of the communities she serves. To reduce that to theatrics or appearance felt to many like erasure, a dismissal not just of her, but of the thousands of voters who elected her to represent them. It didn't help that Leavitt's tone during the remark was offhanded, almost casual. It came across as the kind of thing someone says when they don't expect pushback. And that tone, detached, a little smug, added fuel to the criticism. Because this wasn't a heated moment, it was a calm dismissal. And sometimes calm dismissals are the ones that sting most, especially when they reinforce the idea that certain voices, certain appearances, or certain styles of communication are somehow less valid, less serious, or less American. The fallout was swift. Clips circulated on X, formerly Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram, with users dissecting the moment frame by frame. Analysts replayed the remark, placing it within a broader trend of how black women in Congress are treated differently in media coverage and commentary. Many brought up previous examples: Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's wardrobe, Maxine Waters' passion, Ilhan Omar's accent. Each time, a woman of color reduced to a trait or image, often in ways that white male politicians are rarely, if ever, subjected to. Leavitt's defenders argued that she was merely offering political critique, that Crockett has made her image a part of her brand, and that it's fair game in politics to call that out. But that argument missed the point. Critiquing political strategy is valid. Questioning someone's legislative approach or policy platform is part of the job. But when the criticism veers into personal presentation, especially when it involves racialized language or imagery, it changes. It stops being a debate about ideas and becomes something more personal and more toxic. Even some conservative commentators distanced themselves from the remark, suggesting that while spirited political exchange is welcome, Leavitt's line crossed into unnecessarily personal territory. The moment became less about Crockett's politics and more about what it says when women, especially black women, are discussed in terms of aesthetics and performance instead of intellect and impact. In politics, perception often matters, as much as intent. And while Karoline may not have meant harm, what many heard was a statement that echoed old prejudices in a modern rapper, soft-spoken, network-ready, but still cutting. That's why the moment resonated. not because it was loud, but because it was familiar. And in that familiarity, it became impossible to ignore. When the segment aired, it seemed like just another moment in the daily churn of political television, one that might have gone unnoticed by the broader public. But social media changed that instantly. Within minutes of Karoline Leavitt's comment about Rep. Jasmine Crockett, particularly her line about Crockett caring more about her hair and catchphrases than the Constitution, viewers began posting the clip across platforms. What happened next was a clear illustration of how fast public discourse can shift once a comment touches on cultural nerves, especially when that comment is amplified in the chaotic, reaction-driven world of digital media. At first, the responses were from individual users, many of them regular viewers of political content, who noticed the remark and flagged it as problematic. But the momentum picked up quickly. Political influencers, journalists, and cultural commentators began weighing in, and not all from the same ideological background. People on the left accused Leavitt of trafficking in racially coded language, while others from the center and even some on the right began raising questions about the tone and intent behind her words. What might have been brushed off in a less connected era now had the full force of online attention, and that attention was relentless. On X, formerly Twitter, the clip was viewed millions of times within the first 24 hours. Several prominent accounts reposted it with commentary, pointing out the underlying racial implications of referencing a black woman's hair in a political critique. Others zoomed in on Leavitt's delivery, how casual and dismissive it seemed, and contrasted that with Crockett's actual record in Congress. It became a digital debate, not just about whether the comment was offensive, but about how society treats black women who speak assertively in public forums. Instagram and TikTok added another layer. Users posted reaction videos, duets, and breakdowns of the moment, framing it within broader patterns of how media and political figures often scrutinize black women in positions of power. Many referenced past incidents, public criticisms of Michelle Obama's appearance, for example, or subtle digs aimed at Maxine Waters and Ayanna Pressley, to argue that Leavitt's comment was part of a long-running trend, not an isolated misstep. Hashtags like Arcs Respect Black Women and Jasmine Crockett began trending regionally, then nationally. Progressive political organizations took notice as well. A few issued public statements calling on networks to rethink Leavitt's role as a contributor, accusing her of perpetuating stereotypes that undermine the legitimacy of elected officials. One advocacy group even launched an email campaign targeting advertisers on the program, where the remark aired, urging them to take a stand against coded attacks. While those efforts didn't produce immediate results, they intensified the public spotlight and created pressure not just on Leavitt, but on the networks that hosted her. But perhaps most telling was what happened among more centrist and conservative voices. Some longtime colleagues of Leavitt, including figures who regularly appear on the same panels or podcasts, chose to stay silent. Others offered mild critiques, not necessarily agreeing with the backlash, but acknowledging that the phrasing was ill-advised. These weren't firebrands or ideological opponents. They were people generally in her corner, now expressing discomfort. That shift said a lot. It suggested that, regardless of one's politics, the line she crossed wasn't just ideological, it was cultural and increasingly unacceptable. Part of the intensity of the reaction stemmed from timing. It came during a period when there was already heightened sensitivity around political rhetoric and identity. Just days earlier, another media figure had faced criticism for comments about a female lawmaker, and the public conversation about representation, respect, and double standards in the media was already bubbling. Leavitt's remark poured fuel on that fire, not because it was the worst thing anyone had ever said, but because it was familiar, and it echoed dynamics people were already exhausted from confronting. Another dimension that added to the virality was the contrast between the two women involved. Jasmine Crockett, a black congresswoman with a law background and a reputation for speaking boldly in committee hearings, had increasingly become a symbol of progressive energy in Washington. Karoline Leavitt, a young conservative political commentator and former Trump administration staffer, represented a very different worldview. Their clash, one subtle, the other structural, became a proxy war online. It wasn't just about them. It was about what they represented to different parts of the country. The internet doesn't forget quickly, and in this case, it didn't forgive easily either. The story grew beyond the clip, beyond the segment, and beyond the network. It turned into op-eds, podcast discussions, video essays, and trending threads. What began as a tossed-off comment by a pundit became a national flashpoint, fueled not by shouting or confrontation, but by the quiet virality of a phrase that many believed revealed. Karoline Leavitt's response to the backlash came swiftly, but for many, it missed the mark entirely. After her comment about Representative Jasmine Crockett, where she implied that Crockett was more interested in her hair and catchphrases than the Constitution, sparked waves of criticism online and across media platforms, Leavitt took to social media to defend herself. Her statement read, "We should be able to criticize public officials without being accused of bigotry. I stand by my words." It was short, defiant, and framed as a defense of free speech. But rather than calming the storm, it seemed to intensify. Did mean our. The core issue wasn't that Leavitt had criticized a Democratic member of Congress. That, after all, is routine in American political discourse. The problem was how she had chosen to do it, and her response did little to show she understood that. Her defense came off as dismissive to many. She didn't address the specific language she had used. She didn't acknowledge why her reference to hair had struck such a chord. Instead, she doubled down, positioning herself as a victim of political correctness and cancel culture. That posture might have resonated with a certain audience, but it did not land well in broader circles, including among some who had previously supported her work. In political commentary, perception often matters more than intent. Karoline may not have intended to evoke racially charged stereotypes, but when confronted with that interpretation, she offered no reflection or nuance, just a flat defense. That lack of introspection began to erode the credibility she'd built as a rising conservative voice. She had been seen by some in the media world as a sharp communicator, someone capable of navigating difficult conversations with confidence. But her refusal to engage with the substance of the backlash suggested, to many observers, either an unwillingness or an inability to understand the cultural implications of her words. Behind the scenes, media producers noticed. At first, the networks she regularly appeared on stayed quiet. But over the course of a few days, small changes began to occur. Karoline was quietly removed from a scheduled segment on a weekend politics show. One network that often featured her commentary opted not to include her in their panel lineup the following week. A conservative podcast host, who had previously promoted her appearances, put out a general statement about taking care with language and paused her segment indefinitely. These weren't headline-grabbing moves, they weren't public cancellations, but they were telling. In the world of political media, airtime is currency. And when a contributor starts becoming a liability, or when their presence risks alienating key demographics, networks often choose to distance themselves quietly, without a formal announcement. That's exactly what appeared to be happening to Karoline. She wasn't being banned, she wasn't being censored, but she was, unmistakably, being put on pause. What made the situation more complex was that some of her allies in the conservative movement also began signaling discomfort. A few figures in her orbit, fellow commentators, podcast hosts, and policy wonks, expressed concern in private forums and closed chats about how she had handled the situation. Some felt that she had failed to recognize the weight of her words. Others believed that she had turned a small controversy into a larger one by refusing to clarify or apologize in any meaningful way. One analyst even remarked off the record that there was a way out of this and she didn't take it. Had Karoline acknowledged the criticism with a more thoughtful response, perhaps by recognizing the history behind such comments or clarifying that her intention was to challenge political tactics, not identity, she might have shifted the conversation. Even a moment of humility could have gone a long way. But instead, her public stance remained rigid. That rigidity, more than the original comment itself, became the story. Representative Jasmine Crockett, for her part, didn't fan the flames. She didn't go on a media tour or post a string of angry tweets. In fact, she said very little publicly about the incident. Her quiet refusal to respond in kind was seen by many as a smart, restrained choice. It kept the focus on Leavitt's words, not a back-and-forth feud. Crockett's composure in the face of the controversy only highlighted the misstep further. It reminded observers that professionalism sometimes means knowing when not to engage. Ultimately, Leavitt's attempt to reframe the issue as a matter of free speech and political correctness did not gain much traction outside her base. Her refusal to acknowledge why people were upset, why referencing a black woman's appearance, even obliquely, can carry harmful implications, left the impression that she was either unaware or indifferent to the social dynamics at play. And, in today's hyper-aware media climate, that kind of posture doesn't just come across as tone-deaf, it comes across as careless. The longer Karoline Leavitt stayed silent after her initial defense, the more the consequences of her comment began to crystallize. Not just in terms of public criticism, but in the real-world shifts happening around her. For a while, Leavitt had enjoyed a rising profile in conservative political circles. She was often seen as a fresh, articulate voice representing the next generation of Republican media personalities. She had served as a spokesperson for President Trump's administration, and later became a regular fixture on television panels, podcasts, and political events. But the fallout from her comments about Reparer Jasmine Crockett began to chip away at that momentum, and fast. After doubling down on her remarks rather than offering a clarification or apology, Karoline found herself increasingly sidelined. Invitations to appear on major news segments slowed. A national conservative conference where she had previously been a keynote speaker announced a new lineup, and her name was no longer listed. She wasn't replaced with a liberal voice or even a centrist. Instead, the event leaned on safer, less controversial figures from within the same political camp. That detail mattered. It signaled that this wasn't about ideological disagreement, but about reputational risk. Behind closed doors, campaign strategists and media bookers began asking whether her presence on a panel or show would be more of a distraction than an asset. One insider familiar with a leading news network said, "It's not that we don't like her. It's just that now she brings a lot of baggage to any conversation, and that changes the calculation." The political world, like any industry, is driven by optics, and right now, the optics around Karoline were becoming complicated. It didn't help that her supporters began shrinking in number. While she still retained backing from some corners of the hard-right media, others in the conservative mainstream took a more cautious approach. Several right-leaning commentators, who had once praised her poise and messaging skills, began redirecting their attention toward other rising figures. Some even publicly commented that Leavitt's remarks about Crockett were unwise or unnecessary, careful not to condemn her outright, but subtly signaling a shift in alignment. In politics, those subtle signals are often more damaging than overt denunciations. Meanwhile, Karoline's efforts to frame the backlash as a coordinated cancel culture campaign didn't gain the traction she likely hoped for. While she did appear on a few conservative platforms to explain herself, the tone of those interviews was noticeably more reserved. Hosts who might have once fawned over her were now asking questions with a slightly skeptical edge, pressing her on why she chose that phrasing or whether she would have said the same thing to a male colleague. Her answers remained defiant, but the tone of the conversation had changed. She was no longer being celebrated, she was being scrutinized. Jasmine Crockett, on the other hand, saw her profile quietly rise. The controversy, though not initiated by her, had inadvertently spotlighted her work and poise. Several commentators noted the dignity with which she chose to navigate the incident. Without firing back aggressively, Crockett allowed the public discourse to unfold around her, confident that her record and conduct would speak for themselves. That silence only made Leavitt's original remarks look more petty and personal by contrast. As the days turned into weeks, Karoline's position in the political media landscape became more precarious. It wasn't that she was blacklisted or publicly removed. It was something more subtle and arguably more telling. She was being left out of the conversation. News cycles moved on, but the doors that had once been wide open for her appearances, partnerships, and endorsements began closing quietly. What stood out most was the sense of isolation that followed. Leavitt had once been seen as a media-savvy conservative who could handle tough questions and deliver pointed commentary without crossing lines. But in the aftermath of the Crockett comment, she found herself painted into a corner by her own words and by her refusal to reflect on them. In today's political arena, public figures are often given the opportunity to walk things back, to show growth or learning without abandoning their principles. Karoline had that chance. She could have acknowledged how her language might have been interpreted, even if she hadn't intended harm. Instead, she leaned into defiance, expecting support that didn't fully materialize. That miscalculation, more than the comment itself, left her vulnerable. The backlash wasn't driven by outrage mobs or political enemies. It was driven by a recognition, even among some of her own allies, that certain lines shouldn't be crossed. Not because of political correctness, but because of basic respect. When those lines are crossed and then dismissed as trivial, the cost isn't just online criticism, it's relevance, credibility, and trust. In the end, Karoline Leavitt's situation wasn't about one soundbite, one viral clip, or even one moment of poor judgment. It became a broader conversation about accountability, tone, and the expectations placed on public figures in modern political discourse. The comment she made about Representative Jasmine Crockett might have been intended as sharp political commentary, but it struck a nerve that went deeper than partisan debate. By referencing Crockett's appearance in a dismissive context, Leavitt ignited a cultural reaction that could not be easily dismissed with cries of cancel culture or partisan overreach. Public reaction, both online and within professional media, circles showed how quickly the conversation around a political figure can shift when they appear unaware or indifferent to the broader cultural sensitivities at play. In this case, it wasn't just about defending or condemning Karoline. It was about recognizing the ways public dialogue, particularly around race and gender, has evolved. Audiences are more alert than ever to subtext and implication. And when those elements are ignored by the person at the center of the controversy, it often leads to long-term reputational consequences. Leavitt's unwillingness to offer any meaningful reflection or nuance created the impression that she either didn't understand the impact of her words or simply didn't care. That impression, more than the original comment itself, is what ultimately led to her being distanced from the spotlight she once commanded. Political media is quick to build up new stars, but just as quick to move on when those stars become liabilities rather than assets. What makes this story especially striking is how quietly the shift happened. There was no formal cancellation, no breaking news report about her being fired or banned from networks. Instead, the silence spoke volumes. Appearances were pulled. Invitations were rescinded. And slowly, Karoline began to fade from the lineup of the very platforms that once promoted her so heavily. In the fast-paced world of commentary and opinion, being left off the list is often more damaging than being loudly criticized. Meanwhile, Representative Jasmine Crockett's dignified silence proved more powerful than any rebuttal. She let the weight of public opinion and her track record as a legislator speak for her. That kind of restraint not only boosted her public standing, but also highlighted the very issue at the core of the controversy. The double standards that women, particularly women of color, face in politics. While she didn't seek the spotlight in this moment, it found her, and it left her reputation intact, if not strengthened. Karoline Leavitt's rise was fueled by her assertiveness and media savvy, but her fall, at least in this chapter, was shaped by a refusal to engage with criticism in good faith. In a media landscape that now demands not just strong opinions, but also a level of cultural awareness and accountability, that refusal can be costly. Whether she rebuilds from here or fades further into the background remains to be seen. But this moment will remain a cautionary tale, not just for her, but for every political voice navigating the complicated terrain of 21st century public discourse.